Young college student cried when she married an old man. And on the first night of their marriage, he went to the bathroom, and when he came out, she turned pale at the sight of. But before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy and many blessings. It was not hunger that broke her. It was the certainty that, even being good, the world would never give back the same. Juliana woke up before dawn, as always. The icy wind entered through the gaps of the window without glass, whistling among the slats as if the town itself wanted to drive her away. She sat up in bed, hugging her knees, and listened to the sound she hated most in the world, her father's dry, tearing cough. Camillo coughed with the strength of someone who had smoked despair all his life. The cough was not just a disease. It was punishment. It was the bill for being born poor, for aging without becoming old. In the kitchen, Veronica tried to light the wood stove with the same hands that had once woven dreams. Now, they barely wove warmth for breakfast. Juliana entered quietly, but her mother noticed her immediately. Another sleepless night, Veronica said without looking at her. "It shows in your eyes." "It doesn't matter. Mateo has a fever." "Mateo always has a fever," she replied with resignation. "But you need to take care of yourself, Julie." Juliana didn't respond. The coffee boiled too quickly, as if it too was eager to escape that place. Mateo slept on a mattress at the end of the hallway. He trembled like an abandoned puppy. Juliana covered him better with a worn blanket. The boy murmured something and turned his head. In his thinness and pale face, there was something that tore her apart. "I brought you something," she whispered as she left a piece of hard bread wrapped in a cloth. "Did you eat?" he asked without opening his eyes. Of course, she lied with the ease that habit brings. Juliana hadn't eaten her share for months. She preferred to lie rather than to see him cough up blood. What she didn't know was that he also knew, but said nothing. That's how they were in that house. Everyone lied to survive. Outside the house, the land seemed to sleep. Dust rose with every step. Chickens pecked indifferently. And the village store, with its rusted sign and chipped wooden counter, awaited her like every other day. It was a day like any other. Until it wasn't. But first, there was another humiliation. Santiago, the most attractive young man in the area, the same one who had smiled charmingly at the village festival, crossed paths with Juliana at the store's exit. She had bought rice and bread with counted coins. He carried a bag with bottles of wine and meat. "Juliana," he said. "Do you have a second?" His voice had that tone he used when he wanted something. She, still naive, felt her heart speed up. "Sure," she replied. Santiago looked around and then lowered his voice. "Have you thought about leaving here? Looking for work in the city?" "I've tried," she said. She didn't want to sound weak, but the reality was different. "I have an idea. You could come with me." They offered me a job. As a secretary. It's not much, but to start. Juliana felt the world stop for a second. That was what she had been waiting for. Someone who believed in her. Someone who reached out a hand. "Would you really take me with you?" "Of course. You're smart. And pretty," he said, looking at her for the first time as if she truly existed. For 2 days, Juliana dreamed. She packed in her head. Imagined offices, coffee in cardboard cups, and freedom. But on the 3rd day, Santiago disappeared. Not a word. Not a goodbye. "He told me he can't carry someone like you," a neighbor blurted out with feigned cruelty. "He doesn't want to drag along another family's problems." Juliana swallowed hard. She didn't cry there. She did it alone, that night, in her room, with her face buried in the pillow and her voice broken from so much silence. The heart, which had learned not to get its hopes up, was wrong again. Gray days passed. All the same. All slow. Mateo remained sick. Camillo thinner. Veronica older. And Juliana more broken. That's when she saw him for the first time. He entered the store like an elegant ghost. Tall, with an old but dignified hat, a coat that was too big for him, and a look that seemed to know more than it said. "Do you have butter?" he asked calmly. "Little," Juliana replied. "Then give me the little," he said, smiling. He paid with a bill that covered more than twice what he bought, left the change and left. Juliana saw him again the next day, and the day after. He always bought little, but paid a lot. He always looked at her with that kind of compassion she didn't know whether to hate or thank. One day he brought chocolates. Another, a bag with fruits. He always spoke to her respectfully. That in itself was rare. "What's your name?" she finally asked him. "Esteban." And that was all. Until, without warning, Esteban spoke. "May I come to your house tomorrow? I'd like to speak with your family." Juliana looked at him, both scared and confused. She nodded. That was all she could do. Veronica twisted her face when he showed up the next day with a basket full of food. "What does this man want?" she whispered to Camilo. Camilo didn't answer. Esteban entered, sat at the table as if entering a church, and then, without any roundabout, he said, "I want to propose marriage to your daughter." The silence was absolute. Veronica's eyes widened. Camilo stood up. Mateo banged his fist on the table. "Are you joking?" Camilo asked. "No," said Esteban. "I have resources. I'm not young, I know, but I can take care of her. And you. There won't be a lack of food, nor medicine." "And love?" asked Veronica with a trembling voice. Esteban lowered his gaze. "I don't ask that she love me, but I promise to respect her and give her what she deserves." Juliana looked at him as if the ground were crumbling beneath her feet. That night she didn't sleep. She thought about the bread she didn't eat, about Mateo's fever, about her father's cough, about her mother's worn shoes. And she thought about Santiago, and the shame, and the anger. At dawn, she went out to the yard. Veronica was washing clothes with cold water and soap without foam. "Mom, what should I do?" Veronica stopped scrubbing. She remained silent. "I don't know, daughter. I just want you to be happy. But if you choose this, let it be for you, not for us." Juliana knew at that moment that she had no choice. Because "for you" didn't exist in her world. Because happiness was not an option. Only survival remained. At 6 in the evening, she gathered her family. "I will accept," she said emotionlessly. Camilo banged the table. "No, you can't. He's the age of your grandfather. He doesn't force me. I decide." "And what do you think, Mateo?" asked Veronica as if he could stop her. Mateo looked at his sister. His eyes were moist. "I just want you not to regret it." Juliana didn't answer, because she was already regretting it. In her room, in front of the mirror, she saw herself with a tired face, lifeless hair, skin marked by work. She thought about her dreams of university, of freedom, of real love. And she understood that all of that had died when she was born in that village. The tears fell silently, not because they didn't hurt, but because they had been hurting since before. "Mom," she whispered in the dark. "Have you ever felt that your life wasn't yours?" Veronica, from the threshold, responded without hesitation. "Every day." Juliana closed her eyes. She had made her decision, and she knew there was no turning back. Because in that place, goodness doesn't save anyone. And good people also bleed. Juliana closed her eyes. She had already made up her mind, and she knew there was no turning back. Because in that place, kindness didn't save anyone. And good people, they bleed too. News traveled fast in a town where nothing ever happened. Before the sun reached the center of the sky, everyone already knew that Juliana was going to get married. Not to someone from the town, nor to a young farm worker, nor to a dreamer from the city. She was marrying Esteban, a man who, according to the gossipers, could be her grandfather. Voices multiplied like insects after the rain. At the bakery, in the church, by the well. Some said that Juliana was selling her youth for a plate of food. Others, that she had been forced. And the worst whispered that they always knew she would end up this way, because poor girls, in the end, can only aspire to survive, and that's it. In Juliana's parents' house, the atmosphere was like war. Camilo refused to talk during breakfast. He banged his spoon against the plate as if that could quench his rage. Veronica tried to keep calm, but her face betrayed her. She had swollen eyes as if she had cried all night. Matteo, for his part, paced back and forth like a caged lion. He couldn't sit still. The thought of his sister giving herself to a man who was twice her age drove him to the edge of madness. "Do you understand what you're doing?" Camilo suddenly shouted, rising from the table. "Marrying that old man? Is that what you dream for your life?" Juliana stood still. She didn't look at him. She didn't challenge him. She just answered with a voice so low that everyone had to be quiet to hear her. "I'm choosing for all of us. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night?" Matteo retorted, staring her down. "That you're doing it for us? Don't lie to yourself, Juliana. You're giving up." Veronica stood up. She approached Juliana and caressed her face with trembling hands. "Daughter, if you have doubts, say it now. Don't do it out of compassion." Juliana blinked. The air was so dense it seemed like no one was breathing. "And what if I have no other choice?" she said, with a sigh that dragged years of helplessness. "And what if this is the only door that opens?" No one responded. Because deep down, they all knew it was true. In the days leading up to the wedding, the silence inside the house became more cruel than the screams. Matteo went out to the fields early and returned late, without saying a word. Camilo kept smoking, each cigarette shorter than the last. Veronica devoted herself to sewing her daughter's dress from the old dining room curtains. She added lace from a shirt that no one wore anymore. It was white in parts, with faded edges, but made with love, with guilt, with a pain that only a mother could understand. Juliana, meanwhile, isolated herself. She walked around the yard, talked to herself, lost in thought. Occasionally, a nervous smile escaped her, as if trying to convince herself that this was real, that her life, from that moment on, no longer belonged to her. The wedding day arrived like a sentence. The sky was gray, laden, threatening rain, as if even the weather refused to celebrate. The village church was decorated with flowers picked from the roadside. The benches were half empty, although no one in the square said they wouldn't go. In fact, many attended just to see if Juliana would cry. And she cried. From the moment she entered through the door, in the handmade dress, with shoes borrowed from a neighbor, and the bouquet of wildflowers that Matteo left at the door and signed, the tears began to flow. They were not discreet. They were not sweet. They were rivers of sadness. But no one could read them. Or perhaps they didn't want to, because everyone preferred the easy lie, that she cried from emotion. Esteban awaited her at the front. He wore a gray suit, elegant, outdated. His graying hair was perfectly combed back. He looked at her with a mix of pride, desire, and fear. He was a man who didn't tremble at business, but that morning he seemed as fragile as paper in flames. The priest read the usual words. He spoke of union, fidelity, commitment. Empty words that floated in the air like smoke. Juliana answered, "I do," with a thread of a voice, while her lips trembled. Esteban placed the ring on her. His hands were cold as marble. After the ceremony, there was a small gathering at the house. No music, no dancing, no joy. The food was scarce. The greetings dry. The hugs feigned. No one toasted. No one celebrated. Matteo didn't show up. Camilo sat at the back, watching his daughter as if he were losing her. Veronica served coffee with a tense smile, while the neighbors whispered behind the dishes. As the evening fell, Juliana went up to the room for the last time. She touched the walls, opened the window, looked out at the field. Then she came down with an old suitcase in hand. Veronica hugged her tightly. Camilo kissed her on the forehead, but said nothing. He was broken. Matteo, at last, came out of the chicken coop with red eyes and handed her a folded sheet. "Read it when you're alone," he said. Esteban was waiting outside, next to a black car that didn't seem to belong in that village. The journey to the city was long and silent. Juliana didn't speak. She looked out the window, clutching Matteo's note in her hand. She opened it just before reaching their destination. "Losing you hurts, but it would hurt more to see you broken inside. If you ever feel imprisoned, remember that here there will always be an open door. Don't forget about yourself. Yours, Matteo." Juliana stored the letter inside her dress. She didn't cry. She couldn't. She had dried up inside. The car stopped in front of a huge 2-story house with black gates, a perfectly maintained garden, and warm lights that turned on automatically. Esteban got out first and opened the door for her like a gentleman. Juliana stepped out without saying a word. "This is your home now," he said. The house smelled of wood, expensive perfume, and obsessive cleanliness. The walls were filled with paintings of winter landscapes, as if summer didn't exist there. There were servants, too. They greeted her with a silent bow. That unsettled her. No one in her life had ever bowed to her, not even looked at her that way. The bedroom was spacious, with long curtains, a bed with embroidered sheets, a full-length mirror, and a wardrobe that seemed to hide a universe. Juliana left the suitcase in a corner. Esteban followed her. "You can settle in. You don't need anything else today. Rest." She didn't respond. He offered a faint smile and closed the door. Juliana sat on the bed. The mattress was so soft that she felt she could sink into it forever. She walked around the room. She looked at herself in the mirror. That woman dressed in white with empty eyes was not her. Or perhaps she was, and always had been. She put on a cotton nightgown she found folded on the bed. She went out to the hallway. Everything was quiet. She walked barefoot on the polished wood, went down to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, looked at the clock. The hands seemed to mock her insomnia. She returned to the room, tried to sleep, closed her eyes, dreamt of her mother shouting her name, woke up agitated, heard something, a noise, coming from the bathroom. It wasn't a normal noise, not pipes. It was as if someone was moving, as if someone was breathing differently. The sound of running water, but not an open faucet, rather a presence. Juliana stood up. The nightgown brushed her legs with a chill. She walked down the hallway. The bathroom light was on, but the door was closed. "Esteban?" she whispered. No one answered. The sound of water continued, but it was louder, as if a tub was filling, as if someone was sinking. Juliana put her hand on the knob, hesitated, slowly turned it, pushed the door open. What she saw on the other side was not what she expected. It wasn't the gray-haired Esteban. It wasn't the old man who had promised her protection. It was a young man, broad-shouldered, dark hair, firm body, naked inside the bathtub. He slowly turned his face and looked at her. She stepped back. Her heart pounded like a drum of war. Who are you?" He looked at her, calm, with a half smile. "I'm your husband." And then, the world stopped making sense. Juliana stepped back again. Her bare feet struck the door frame, sending a chill up her legs to her throat. The figure in the bathtub watched her with a terrifying calm, as if everything was unfolding according to a script that only he knew. The water covered his chest, but his face, it wasn't the face of the old man she had married that morning. He was young. Not just young. Attractive. Confident. His eyes were the same color, yes, but no longer weary or creased by time. Now they were intense, firm, so alive they seemed to undress her without touching. "What are you saying?" Juliana managed to articulate, barely a whisper. The man slowly emerged from the water. Juliana turned her face away, ashamed and confused. She grabbed the towel from the wall and threw it at him awkwardly. He caught it midair, unruffled, as if he had expected it. He wrapped it around his waist and approached her. His steps echoed on the floor like a verdict. "I am Esteban, the same one who entered your store every day, the same one who knelt at your house, the same one you married, but not the one you saw. Not entirely." Juliana couldn't help but look at his face. It was him, and it wasn't him. This duality tore her apart inside. Fear mixed with anger, confusion with pain. Her hands trembled. "You," she whispered. "What did you do?" Esteban took a deep breath. He led her to the living room without touching her, but with words that pushed. "Let me explain. Please." Juliana sat on the leather sofa, still dressed in her nightgown, legs pulled up to her chest. Esteban sat across from her, now dressed in a t-shirt and dark pants. He seemed like a different person. Everything about him was different, except the voice. That voice that had accompanied her for weeks, that had convinced her that at least one man in the world could protect her. That voice that now sounded like a betrayal. My grandfather was a very wealthy man. He built an empire from nothing. And he died with one condition in his will, that I find a good woman. Not good in words, good in soul, in essence, capable of loving without expecting anything in return. Juliana watched him as if listening to a science fiction story. And you thought the best way to do that was to disguise yourself as an old man and deceive me? I didn't want to deceive you. I needed to know if you were real. I didn't want you to love me. I just wanted to see if you could be loyal, compassionate, if you were the woman he saw in you. What did he see in me? She interrupted. Did your grandfather know me? Esteban nodded. He helped you in the store. On a day no one recognized him. You had been working all day. You had no smile left. But you helped him with his bags. You offered him water. You smiled at him. And you didn't know who he was. He came back that day and told me, that young woman has a heart that cannot be bought. Juliana felt her throat tighten. So you decided to put on a mask and play with me? Was that what I was to you? An experiment? It wasn't that, he said, his eyes full of pleading. It was a test. But I never imagined it would affect me so much. Affect you. I fell in love with you. The phrase dropped like a bomb. Juliana stood up abruptly. Her eyes shone with anger, disillusionment, something she couldn't name. Which version of me did you fall in love with? The broken girl who agreed to marry an old man to save her family? The woman you thought was weak? Or the fool who cried on her wedding day believing she was sacrificing for something greater than herself? Esteban lowered his gaze. He had no answers. Not for those questions. I don't care what your intention was, she continued. What you did was cruel. You gave me security only to tear it away. You made me think I was making a decision out of necessity, and now I find out it was all a lie. I don't even know if this marriage is legal. It is, he said softly. And does that make you better? Esteban stood up. He took a step towards her. Juliana, I swear I never intended to hurt you. I just wanted to know if there were any genuine people left. And you are. You accepted everything for your family. Not out of self-interest. Not out of greed. And that made me see you in a way I never thought I would see anyone. Your strength, your loyalty, your ability to endure, disarmed me. You disarmed me. Juliana shouted, her voice not sounding like her own. You took away my freedom, my right to decide with the truth. You dragged me into a perverse game, Esteban. You had power, money, time, and you used it to test me as if you were God. Who do you think you are? Esteban swallowed. The silence that followed was more violent than any shout. I am not God. Just a man who didn't know how to trust. A man who has seen too much falsehood. A man who thought he could see someone's soul through lies. I was wrong. I shouldn't have done it this way. Juliana breathed heavily. Her hands clenched into fists. I don't know who you are. I don't know if you ever existed. Esteban approached slowly. I am the same. The one who listened to you talk about your dreams. The one who heard you talk about your brother, your parents, what you felt. I wasn't pretending when I listened to you. Everything else, yes. But not that. Juliana didn't respond. She stood there, trembling with anger and pain. Each word he said sank her deeper. Because she hated him, and she also hated what she felt. Because deep down, very deep down, a part of her wanted to believe him. And that was the most unforgivable of all. Take me to my family, she said firmly. Esteban looked at her. Now, tonight. Take me. I want you to tell them what you did. Look them in the eyes. Explain why their daughter married someone who never existed. Esteban nodded. He said nothing more. He knew it was the least he could do. The ride back was different. There was no music, no conversation. Just the roar of the engine and the crunch of thoughts. Juliana sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the road. Inside, she felt like shattered glass, each piece pointing inward. Esteban drove without looking at her. His hands were firm, but his eyes were nervous. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't know how to explain himself to Camilo, to Veronica, to Mateo, even less to himself. Juliana turned her head and looked at him for a moment. Is there anything else I don't know? Esteban pressed his lips together. He hesitated. Then he shook his head. No, everything you've seen is what I am. A coward disguised as a wise man. Juliana looked forward again. Then let's see if your truth is enough to mend what you broke. The night was thick. The town slept. But Juliana did not. Never again. Because she no longer knew in which world she lived. And perhaps, most terrifyingly, she didn't know in which world she wanted to live. The night had devoured the sky, leaving not a single star in sight. The road, winding and dark, felt like a tunnel connecting two realities that should never have met. The air inside the car had grown thick, heavy, as if the unspoken words floated between Juliana and Esteban, brushing against them, making them bleed on the inside without ever touching them. Neither of them spoke. The engine was the only one that dared break the silence, its constant hum almost timid, like an intruder who knew he didn't belong there. The rain started without warning. Small drops hit the windshield, at first scattered, then furious, as if the sky itself wanted to hide what was about to happen that night. Esteban turned on the wipers. Juliana didn't move. She didn't care if the storm swallowed them in the middle of nowhere. She had already felt enough cold in her soul to fear the water. When the car turned onto the dirt road that led to the house, Juliana felt her stomach tighten. Not because of the mud or the puddles, but because of the weight of what she was about to face. Her mother, her father, her brother, her world. Everything she had wanted to protect. Everything she believed she had saved. The dim light coming from the kitchen window told her they were still awake. Maybe they hadn't slept since she left. Or maybe they had, but with a sleep so empty it hadn't brought rest. Esteban turned off the engine. The sound of the rain pounding the car's roof grew deafening. Are you sure about this? He asked, without looking at her. Juliana opened the door without answering. She stepped barefoot into the mud. She didn't care if she got the dress dirty, the one that had once been white. The cold water soaked her ankles, but she didn't stop. She walked toward the door like someone surrendering to a firing squad. Esteban followed her, slower. Every step felt as if he were dragging a corpse on his back. And in a way, he was. The corpse of his lie. Juliana knocked hard. 3 times. She didn't wait for anyone to open. She went in. Camilo was sitting in his chair, face buried in his hands. Veronica was ironing a shirt that didn't need ironing. Mateo, in a corner, arms crossed, saw her first. You came back? He said, with a mix of surprise and resentment. Juliana nodded. Then, she stepped aside and let Esteban enter behind her. Veronica dropped the iron to the floor. Camilo lifted his head. His expression changed in seconds, from exhaustion to confusion, and from confusion to rage. Who is he? Esteban swallowed hard. He took 2 steps toward the center of the room, where the hanging lamp barely lit his face. It's me, Esteban. Camilo stood up. The chair screeched loudly. You're not Esteban. Who are you? He is, Juliana interjected firmly. He's the same man who came into the shop. The one who asked for my hand. The one I married. Veronica didn't understand. She looked at her daughter, then at the man, then back at her daughter. Her voice came out as a broken whisper. But Esteban was old. Esteban stepped forward again. Slowly, he removed his coat. Then, he ran his fingers along the edge of his hair. He took it off. The wig fell to the floor. With a handkerchief, he began wiping his face, removing the fake wrinkles, the makeup that had aged him. He did it in silence, like a ritual, like punishment. When he finished, what stood before them was a man in his 30s, with a sharp gaze, with firm skin, with the naked truth. Veronica stepped back. Her lips trembled. "What is this?" "A lie," Juliana answered. "One I didn't know either." Camillo said nothing. His chest rose and fell as if it were about to explode. Mateo was the first to move. He walked up to Esteban, looked at him up close, then shoved him. "What are you, an actor? A psychopath? You here to laugh at us?" Esteban didn't defend himself. "I'm not here to laugh. I'm here to confess." "Confess what?" Camillo roared. "That you mocked my daughter? That you used her for some kind of experiment? What kind of sick bastard does that?" Juliana closed her eyes. Every word was a knife that pierced her too. "My grandfather gave me a condition to receive his inheritance," Esteban said, his voice heavy. "He wanted me to find a woman with a real heart. Not someone after money. Not someone calculating. Someone who still knew how to love without expecting anything in return." Veronica covered her mouth with both hands. "And your solution was to deceive our daughter? Dress up? Play with her emotions?" "It wasn't a game," he said, stepping forward. "It was a desperate gamble. I didn't trust anyone, not even myself, until I met her. And she broke me. With her kindness, her sacrifice, her silence. No one had ever looked at me the way she did, knowing I wasn't offering love, only a promise of relief." Mateo looked at him like he wanted to strike him. "So what now? You expect us to forgive you? Say, 'That's sweet, thanks for everything'?" "No, I didn't come for that. I came because she made me, because you deserve the truth, and because, even if you don't believe it, I love her." Camillo laughed. A dry sound, almost a spit. "Love? Love doesn't grow out of a mask. Love isn't built on lies." "I didn't know," Juliana said, breaking her silence. "I didn't know until I saw him without the mask. When I saw him in the bathtub, and he wasn't the man I agreed to marry. He was someone else. Younger, stronger, real." Veronica started crying. "And you knew this before marrying him?" "No, Mom. I married an old man. For you. For Mateo. For you, Dad. For a roof. For medicine. For dignity. I thought I was selling myself. And then I found out even that wasn't true. Because I was bought with a lie." Camillo walked to the door, threw it open. The rain burst in hard. "Get out of my house," he said to Esteban. "I don't want to see your face again. Or your truths." Esteban lowered his gaze. Didn't move. "I won't leave unless Juliana tells me to. She's the only one who can send me away." Mateo walked to his sister, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you love him?" The question struck like lightning in the night. Juliana didn't answer. She looked at Esteban, then at her father, then at the rain. She felt everything spinning in her chest. "I don't know what I feel. I just know it hurts." Veronica stepped closer, hugged her. "Then wait. Love isn't something you choose in the middle of pain." Camillo stood still. Rain soaked him. He looked like a statue of flesh. Juliana hugged him too. He didn't push her away, but he didn't hug back either. His heart was a closed fist. Mateo was the only one who stepped toward Esteban, looked him up and down, then extended his hand. "You're an idiot," he said. "But if what you feel is real, then fight. But no more masks. Because if you hurt her again, you won't need a disguise for me to break your face." Esteban shook his hand, nodded, didn't say a word. He had already said too much. The family went back inside. Juliana closed the door. Esteban stayed outside, in the rain, waiting, because he knew that forgiveness doesn't come when you ask for it. It comes when you deserve it. And that night, the truth came out naked. Cruel, painful, but necessary. Because only what is built on truth has any chance of surviving. The rain had stopped at dawn, leaving the sky gray and covered with unmoving clouds, as if the entire universe were holding its breath. The mud in the yard still bore the footprints of Esteban, who had remained outside all night under the rain, without saying a single word. When the sun peeked through the clouds, Camillo saw him through the window. He said nothing. He closed the curtain and sat back down. He didn't even know if what he felt was anger, respect, or that bitter mix of both that only men who have lost their place in the world can understand. Juliana woke up with her eyes burning. She had dreamed she was walking through a never-ending field, that her house was drifting away, that her mother was crying in silence and her father didn't recognize her. She got up, went to the kitchen, and saw Veronica stirring the coffee as if that motion were the only thing keeping her upright. "He's still there," her mother said without turning. "He hasn't left since last night." Juliana didn't answer. She sat at the table. The smell of dampness still clung to the walls. The silence was different from other days. It had shape, weight, and left no room for excuses. An hour later, Esteban knocked on the door. 3 times, firmly. No one moved. It was Mateo who opened it. "Don't you have a home to go back to?" Esteban nodded, without a trace of sarcasm. "I do. But what I came to do isn't finished yet. What do you want now?" "I want you to come outside. All of you." "Why?" "Because there's something you need to see." Mateo didn't move. Juliana appeared behind him. "What did you do?" "What I promised," Esteban replied. "Not with words. With actions." Juliana hesitated, then looked at her mother. Veronica set the spoon aside. Camilla walked through the door without a question. They all stepped out together, dragging their feet through the wet earth. In front of them, in the middle of the road, stood a truck. Huge. White. With 2 men unloading boxes, furniture, mattresses wrapped in plastic. At the end of the small path across the plot, there stood a house that hadn't been there before. Small, yes, but new. With clean walls, large windows, and a smoking chimney as if silently inviting them in. Veronica brought her hands to her chest. Camilo squinted. "What is that?" "Your new home," Esteban said. No one said a word. "I bought it a month ago. I was waiting for the right moment. I made sure it was ready. It has 3 bedrooms, a fully equipped kitchen, a bathroom with hot water, and a living room with a real fireplace. Not fake like so many others. Real like you." Veronica started to cry. She didn't cover her face this time. She didn't want to hide it. She cried with her eyes open, staring at the house as if it were a mirage she didn't dare approach. "This doesn't erase everything," Camilo said, his voice rough. "I don't want to erase anything," Esteban replied. "I just want you to live with the dignity you deserve." Juliana stared at him with her lips pressed together. She didn't know whether she wanted to hug him or scream at him. Because everything she had suffered seemed to melt away in front of that image, her mother broken by emotion, her father looking at the house as if it were the answer to a lifetime of effort, her brother swallowing hard so he wouldn't cry. "There's more," Esteban continued. "Camilo, I spoke to a doctor in the city. Your lungs need urgent treatment. Everything's taken care of. They're expecting you tomorrow. You don't have to pay anything." Camilo turned his head. For a moment, he looked younger. Or maybe just less tired. "I didn't ask you for anything." Neither did Juliana. "And yet here I am." Veronica walked toward Esteban. She took his hand. Squeezed it tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not for the money. Not for the house. Thank you for seeing what others didn't. For looking at my daughter with clear eyes, even if you had to wear a disguise to do it." Esteban felt his eyes burn. "I wasn't clear, Veronica. I was a coward with dirty methods. But what I felt, that was honest." Mateo approached the house, knocked on the door, went in, then came back out with a smile no one had ever seen on him before. "There are books, and a guitar hanging on the wall." "How did you know Juliana told me. She said you always dreamed of learning." Mateo didn't know what to say. He stuffed his hands into his pockets, lowered his head. He wasn't ready to give in completely, but the seed had been planted. "You're doing all this to buy our forgiveness," Juliana said at last. Esteban shook his head. "No. I'm doing this because it's what I should have done from the beginning. Because I no longer want to be a man who tests others. I want to be someone who deserves what he loves." She didn't respond. She walked toward the new house, touched it with her hand, felt the fresh paint, the warmth coming from inside. She turned to face him. "I don't know if this brings me closer to you or pushes me even farther away. What you do with what you feel is yours," Esteban said. "I just wanted you to know that you don't have to sacrifice yourself anymore. That pain is no longer currency to buy dignity. That night, they all had dinner together for the first time in weeks. At the new table, with new plates, warm food, and laughter beginning to rise without fear. Matteo played the guitar awkwardly. Camillo allowed himself to be served without protest. Veronica turned on the radio. A soft melody filled the house like a caress. Juliana, sitting next to Esteban, glanced at him from the side. He didn't touch her, didn't pressure her, didn't reach for her hand. He was simply there, present, mask-free. "What are you going to do tomorrow?" she asked. "Whatever you want me to do." She turned her head toward the window. Outside, the moon slipped between the clouds. She took a deep breath. "Then stay. But not for me. Stay for you. To prove to yourself that you can still deserve what you long for." Esteban closed his eyes, smiled, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. Because he knew that real love isn't asked for. It's built. Day by day. Word by word. Without masks. And that night, while everyone slept, Juliana wrote on a sheet of paper, "I am not a victim. I am root. I am woman. And this time, I choose." Then she placed the paper in her drawer, closed the door, and slept in peace. At last. The night before had been the calmest since the truth came to light. Juliana had slept deeply, without nightmares, without jolts. The new house still smelled of raw wood, fresh paint, of future. Veronica cooked with enthusiasm. Matteo dared to sing aloud while strumming the guitar, and Camillo, after his first medical appointment in the city, had returned with a shy smile and a gaze less dim. It seemed like the pieces were finally beginning to fit. It seemed. But sometimes, calm is only the silence before the scream. The first envelope arrived with no sender. No stamps, no postal marks. Just her name handwritten, in an irregular script that looked shaky or forced. She found it at the mailbox of the new home, right above the bread the neighbor left every week. Juliana opened it on autopilot. The paper was thin, without letterhead. Just a few lines written in black ink. Not everything that glitters is gold. Not everything that stays silent is innocent. Have you asked yourself why his grandfather died alone? Her blood froze. She read the sentence 3 times. Then she crumpled the paper, folded it, and stored it in the drawer where she used to hide her nighttime reflections. She didn't say a word to anyone, not even to Esteban. The following days passed with the same serene routine. Esteban kept working remotely from his computer, and on weekends he dedicated himself to helping the family, organizing the garden, buying materials for small repairs, talking to Camillo without tension. Everything seemed natural. Too much. The second envelope came the next week. This time, she found it among the tomatoes in the grocery bag she had left unattended for a couple of minutes. Another letter. Another warning. He lied to you before. What makes you think he's not lying now? The inheritance wasn't about nobility. It was about elimination. Juliana felt her stomach twist. Esteban had always spoken of his grandfather as a wise, demanding man, a bit harsh but noble. Not cruel. Not manipulative. What did that letter mean by elimination? She placed the second note into a wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother. And with it, she buried her questions for a few hours. But not for long. The nights began to unsettle her. She slept poorly. Dreamed of dark rooms, locked doors, figures at the edge of her vision that vanished whenever she turned her head. Dreamed of a man who wasn't Esteban, but had his voice. A man who watched her from the shadows with a smile that meant no good. The third envelope had no words. Only a photograph. Black and white. Old-fashioned style. Esteban, younger, perhaps 10 years ago, embracing a red-haired woman. They weren't posing. They weren't smiling. They stood in an open field, and her eyes were fixed on the camera with a mixture of anguish and resignation. Juliana felt her head spin. Who was that woman? Why that look? That night, she waited for Esteban to fall asleep. Then she went down to the study, turned on the desk lamp, and began going through her husband's files. The folders were arranged meticulously, as if he feared forgetting something. Between the pages of an old notebook, she found an expired passport, stamps from trips to Switzerland, to Canada, and folded newspaper clippings. One of them caught her attention. A short note, no photo, titled with a dry phrase, 29-year-old woman disappears. Police do not rule out suicide. Her body went rigid. The name of the woman was Cecilia Duarte. And according to the article, the last person to see her had been Esteban. Juliana felt reality crack beneath her feet. The kitchen, the new house, the embraces with her parents, all seemed stained with a dirty suspicion, a shadow impossible to ignore. She closed the notebook, went upstairs, and watched him sleep. His chest rose and fell calmly. But in his dreams, he muttered nonsense. Words she didn't understand. Or maybe she did, but didn't want to. The next morning, as Esteban made coffee, she stared at him from the chair. The steam from the cup rose like a signal. He noticed. Smiled at her. She didn't smile back. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Who is Cecilia Duarte?" Esteban's face changed in an instant. He turned pale. His hands froze. The coffee began to overflow, but he didn't notice. "Where did you hear that name?" "I didn't hear it. I saw it. In a photo. In a clipping. In your study." Esteban set the cup down. Sat across from her. His eyes darkened. "I didn't want you to find out like this." "So it's true?" "I had a relationship with her. Years ago. We met through a foundation for young entrepreneurs. It was intense. Uneven. She had problems. Addiction. Mental health. I thought I could help her. But I couldn't. And she disappeared? Yes, but not because of me. She left one night. Left a note. It was her decision." Juliana looked at him, tense, unmoving. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I was afraid you'd think what you're thinking now." "And what am I thinking, Esteban?" "That I'm capable of lying to get what I want." Juliana stood up, went to the bedroom, opened the drawer, took out the 3 envelopes, threw them on the table. "Who's sending me these?" Esteban picked up one of the letters. "Read it silently, then set it back down." "I don't know, but I'm sure it's not a coincidence. Someone wants to tear down what we're building. Isn't it you? Another test, maybe? I'm not that man anymore." Juliana looked him in the eyes. For a second, she believed him. But then she remembered the photo. Cecilia's expression. The ambiguity. "Esteban, did you ever lay a hand on her?" "No." "Did you yell at her?" "Yes. When I didn't know how else to help. I yelled. At her. At myself. It was a mess. But I didn't hurt her." "Did you love her?" "I thought I did. But now I know I didn't. Because I loved you in silence, even while pretending to be someone else. I loved her loudly, desperately. And I destroyed her." The words hung in the air like blades. Juliana went to her mother's room. Lay beside her. Veronica didn't ask anything. She simply embraced her. Ran her fingers through her hair. Like when she was a child. As if she knew there were monsters outside. Or worse, inside. The next day, a 4th envelope arrived. Juliana didn't find it. Mateo did. It was in the toolbox, wrapped in duct tape. He opened it without warning. And his scream shook the house. Inside was another photograph. Esteban, young, clean-shaven, holding Cecilia's hand. Smiling. But on the table in front of them, blurry but undeniable, there was a knife. With dark stains. Liquid. Fresh. Mateo ran up the stairs 2 at a time. "Juliana, you have to see this." She came down. Esteban heard them from the hallway. The knife stared at them from the photo. Like a sign. Like a secret not yet fully revealed. Juliana felt the world closing in. And then she understood that sometimes real fear doesn't lie in what you see, but in what you begin to imagine. And can't stop imagining. Ever. The knife in the photograph looked like it had a life of its own. It wasn't just an object. It was a symbol. A weight that pierced Juliana's stomach with the blade of doubt. The image was blurry, yes, but not so much that she could ignore the obvious. The stain on the blade was dark, viscous, far too thick to be wine or sauce or paint. It was blood. Or at least that's what her mind screamed. Esteban denied having ever seen that photo before, denied holding that knife, denied being at that place at that time. His voice was steady, but his eyes, the eyes she had fallen in love with, wavered. Not from guilt, from fear. And it was that fear that shattered the thin line between trust and paranoia. Juliana left the house without saying where she was going. She took only a small backpack, some clothes, a notebook, and the newspaper clipping about Cecilia Duarte's disappearance. She boarded the early morning bus as if fleeing a war no one else could see, and stared out the window for hours without focusing on anything. Her heart was torn between the need to know and the fear of knowing too much. The town where Cecilia had lived was small, like all the places where tragedy hides within the ordinary. The streets were narrow and dusty. The houses all similar, each with its own story. Upon arriving, Juliana searched for the name in the public library. Only traces remained. A longer article in a local magazine said Cecilia had vanished, leaving behind debts, rumors of blackmail, and even a personal diary that was never found. There were many assumptions, but no facts. She asked around at several houses until finally, an older woman recognized her. She lived at the end of the cobblestone street. Her name was Clara. Her eyes were clouded with age, her voice worn, as if it carried decades of silence. Cecilia? Oh yes, I remember her, Clara said, slowly sitting in an old rocking chair, the skin on her hands as thin as paper. She always seemed like she was just passing through. She never put down roots. She was beautiful, but she didn't trust anyone, not even herself. And Esteban? A good boy. Strange, but good. Always so proper. She seduced him. She loved playing with him. Had him wrapped around her finger. Everyone knew it. Juliana swallowed hard. And her disappearance? No one took her. She left on her own. That's what many of us believe. Her body was never found. No traces either. But before she left, there was a fight. Screaming. I heard it from here. Then she was gone. Or so we think. Because no one ever saw her again. Juliana looked at the old woman, her eyes moist. Do you think Esteban? No, I don't. I saw his hands trembling as he searched for her. How he called her for days. How he locked himself away afterward. No, dear. If he loved her, he lost her. And if he lost her, it wasn't by his hands. Juliana stayed a while longer, grateful for the raw honesty. Clara offered her tea. Told her stories about how Cecilia used to dance in the town square like an actress on an invisible stage. Juliana listened, feeling each word wash away a stain from the photo, a shadow from Esteban's face. When she returned home, she found him sitting at the entrance, staring blankly at the fields. The moon was full, its light slipping between the trees, as if everything wanted to be seen more clearly. He saw her approach but didn't move. Juliana set her backpack down, walked over, looked at him. He was the first to speak. I thought you wouldn't come back. I thought the same. Esteban sighed. I have nothing left to hide from you. I didn't kill Cecilia, but she killed me on the inside, took away my ability to trust. And with that, I built the lie that brought you to me. I went to her town, Juliana said. I spoke to a woman who lived nearby. She told me Cecilia left, that you looked for her, that it hurt you. I loved her like you love for the first time, madly, and she destroyed me. I thought it was love, but it wasn't. It was need. With you, it was different. That's why I was so afraid. Juliana sat beside him, looked straight ahead. In the distance, the crickets sang. The world seemed to hold its breath once again. You hurt me, Esteban. Not just with your first lie, also with your silence. You made me doubt myself. Made me think I was the crazy one, the paranoid one. You made me fight against my own instincts. I know. And because of that, if you want to leave me now, I won't blame you. I just wanted you to know the truth. All of it. Even if it costs me losing you." She looked at him. And for the first time, she didn't see the man in disguise, or the businessman, or the young man from the photograph. She saw someone broken, but not by guilt, by truth. She saw his fragility as a reflection of her own. "Let's go to the grave," she said suddenly. Esteban looked at her. "Cecilia's?" "No, your grandfather's." Esteban blinked, said nothing, nodded. They got up, took the car, drove in silence. When they arrived at the cemetery, the fog was already beginning to settle over the gravestones. His grandfather's grave was modest. A simple plaque. No fancy epitaphs. Just a name. And a date. Juliana knelt down, placed a wildflower she had picked along the road. "Thank you," she whispered, not knowing why. Esteban watched her, then stepped closer, knelt beside her. "This is where I promised him I'd find someone real. And I did. But I didn't know what to do once I had it in front of me. Because you were used to hiding. And you were used to surviving." Juliana looked at him, touched her chest. "My strength isn't a shield anymore. It's memory. What I've lived shaped me. But it doesn't define me. Not anymore." Esteban swallowed. "Can we start over?" She stood up, took his hand. No masks, no tests, no fear. The wind blew hard, as if his grandfather, from his corner of earth, had let out a sigh. They returned home hand in hand. No more words were spoken. They weren't needed. The truth was no longer the enemy. It was a companion. Painful, yes, but freeing. That night, while Esteban slept, Juliana opened her notebook. She wrote, "Sometimes what seems like a lie is just a truth dressed in fear. And what we think is a test is the path to truly knowing ourselves. Love, when it's real, doesn't shout. It's built, even if it shakes, even if it bleeds, even if it shows up wearing doubt. Because only someone who has been wounded can learn to touch more gently." She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and at last, she stopped dreaming of closed doors. Because she had opened the only one that mattered, the door to her own soul. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments, what would you do in a similar situation? We invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends or family as a show of support. That motivates us to keep posting exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We truly appreciate having you here with us. You can click on the links showing up on your screen right now. We've got an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment made just for you. See you in the next video. A big hug.